In this lecture, I'll be discussing militarization. You can see from the images here, there's been an increase in militarization in various regions across the globe, in both rural regions such as the Arctic, as well as in urban centers where you see police forces, such as these sheriffs here, and these images to the right there, of individuals, police officers in Ferguson recently. So some of the big questions and things to think about overall in this lecture: what has been the extent of military in various aspects of life? How has society been organized around military ideals? We'll begin by discussing the extent of military spending across the globe, and we'll look at various ethnographic examples looking at militarism and militarization, both in the United States as a whole, as Catherine Lutz talks about. Kajirios talks about this in the context of Hawaii. Steingreber in Ethiopia. Hawkins talks about this from the perspective of an individual involved in the military, and the military as a greedy institution. Ben-Ari and Frustuk talk about live fire exercises in Japan. Lippman looks at militarism and education with particular emphasis in Chicago. And Sitha Low, former president of the American Anthropological Association, talks about the erosion of public spaces in New York City with increased surveillance. If we look at this phenomenon globally in terms of militarization, we see an increase in defense funds overall. And indeed, there has been an increase in the last for the last 5 years, there has been a downtrend in the terms of military spending overall. We are seeing an upswing as recently as this year. Russia is probably one of the biggest movers here, but it's interesting to note that globally, the United States nearly outspends the other top 15 countries in terms of defense overall. And so what does that look like, and what are the ramifications for the United States as a whole? If you look at the top military spending globally, the United States spends $600.4 billion, and this is as of 2013. These are all in US dollars. Per capita, this represents $2,000 for every man, woman, and child within the United States. China comes in second on this list, but indeed you can see that it's rather dwarfed, only about a quarter of the spending that goes, or less than a quarter of the spending that goes into the U.S. military, and only $83 per capita, followed by Russia. Again, Russia is expanding its military budget, and followed then by Saudi Arabia, which of note spends more per capita than the United States at $2,100 per individual. These figures come from the International Institute of Strategic Studies. So what are the ramifications of all of this military spending overall within society? And how is money to be spent? How is federal money to be spent to ensuring order within society through defense, through protecting society from outside enemies? We saw some of this in the context of the discussions about crime and punishment, in terms of how society must defend itself internally. When we're talking about militarism, it acts both externally in terms of defense, but also internally as well. And so what do we mean exactly when we talk about militarization? Lutz, following others in her 2002 article, Making War at Home in the United States, Militarization in the Current Crisis, defines militarization as the contradictory and tense social process in which civil society organizes itself for the production of violence. This involves intensification of the labor and resources allocated to military purposes, including the shaping of other institutions in synchrony with military goals. So if you stop and think about this, what are some examples that come to mind in terms of other institutions that have been shaped towards military goals as a whole? Certainly there's been much discussion, as I'll talk about later in this lecture, in the context of education as a whole. And I think what Lutz is getting at, and other anthropologists that have looked at this phenomena of violence and war in particular, is this something which is universal across the human spectrum. And Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes noted that so long as man dwells upon the globe, his destiny is to battle. War's message is divine. And so it becomes this inescapable struggle for survival overall. But there have been commentators across time, such as former President Eisenhower, when he was asked about the mushrooming military budget. He responded that it would leave the nation a militarized husk hardly worth defending. And so this calls into question the amount of military spending in relation to how else money should be spent domestically, welfare programs, education, for the betterment of the population as a whole. Let's also note that indeed the United States is a nation made by war, very much framed in historic fashion as a heroic battle of conquering an enemy that was more powerful than it, the war with Britain and eventual independence of the United States overall. But there's also other sides to these battles that are sometimes underplayed, particularly the long struggles with Native American peoples throughout the United States and the continued dispossession and marginalization of many Native Americans and Alaska Natives, as well as Native Hawaiians within the United States. We also see that, indeed, the long history of slavery within the United States and violence in a everyday fashion for Africans and later African Americans. Lutz notes that there have been 3 major upswings in military spending in the United States, followed by some downward movement, but for the most part a rather continuous rise in terms of military spending. The 3 main time periods are the 1939 with the rise of fascist forces, 1947 with a national security state, and then post 9/11. And Lutz does her ethnographic work in North Carolina and Fayetteville, and she looks at the impacts of military bases and what she calls essentially a surplus population of cheap labor and what that does to the local economy as a whole. Also noting that many of the services are internal to the base. So there are many factors to consider when looking at the economic ramifications of military bases as a whole. And some of the other authors also talk about these issues as well. From the perspective of within the military, you have anthropologists who have been in the military or are currently serving in the military. Probably one of the most contentious issues has been the advisory roles or cultural consultants in terms of human terrain mapping or human terrain systems, which looking at culture and anthropology and social sciences in general in order to determine potential enemies and eliminating threats before they are realized. Hawkins in Ben-Ari in a 2004 piece writes about the military and militarization in the United States and notes from the perspective of an enlisted member of the military in Germany that there's almost a continuous micromanagement of almost every aspect of life, and that this in fact led to a fostering of self-protective behavior by troops as well as commanders. Hawkins points out that the military is a greedy institution, and others have talked about the military as being a total institution, separate from other institutions, and can, in fact, a lot of the conversations that occur within and about the military as a whole, things like basic training, the idea of breaking down the individual and then building the individual back up in synchrony with the military and its ideals overall. Hawkins notes that military realities, like many realities, are socially constructed and interpreted. However, the military is a rather unique institution. You have total institutions such as the military, as well as some have argued prisons as well. I did some work in Alaska with some folks who were doing work with family readiness groups, and these groups are called upon. They often mirror in hierarchical structure that of the spouses, the rank of their spouses. So those that would be in commanding positions are often In the military itself, their spouses are often in commanding positions in the family readiness group as well. And this is one of the aspects of this being a very greedy institution. These individuals aren't paid, but they have to behave in a particular way. And this goes not only for military spouses, but also children as well. Kajihiro, in his 2000 piece, Nation Under the Gun, Militarism and Resistance in Hawaii, talks about militarization in Hawaii and discusses the history of the overthrow of the Queen in 1893, that the United States military worked in collusion with U.S. businessmen. This is Wendy Marshall's piece where she talks about language revitalization in Oahu. Bello has called Hawaii a transnational garrison state. Many within the military refer to Hawaii as a linchpin in the Asia-Pacific theater. In 1998, there were about 47,000 active duty personnel and 85,000 dependents that were stationed in Hawaii. This comprised about 11% of Hawaii's residents overall. Overall, the military controls 205,925 acres of land, or about 5% of land. This includes important religious sites, sites that are used for subsistence as well. On Oahu, the number is even more striking, with 22.4% of the land controlled by the military. Fundamental to discussions in terms of indigenous rights is that the military uses are often in conflict with fundamental Native Hawaiian values of the land and for the land itself. And so they are fundamentally against the cultural and spiritual values of the land, and that they involve the destruction of the land in one form or another. And some of the examples would be the unexploded ordinances that are scattered about Hawaii, as well as a number of Superfund sites. There are 5 that Kajiro points out that were in Pearl Harbor area alone. In Pearl Harbor area alone, this used to be an incredibly rich habitat for fishing and fish production overall in terms of ponds, and of course all of these were dredged and destroyed. The history of Hawaii in terms of the dispossession of Native Hawaiians has been critiqued by different iterations of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. This is not one unified movement, and Leilani Trask in particular points out the possession and the taking of Hawaii. And Trask is a legal scholar. She points out that this taking is against, in fact, international law, and that what we have right now is still the illegal occupation of Hawaii under international law. Within United States law and within the context of the state of Hawaii, we've seen many laws that have come on the books that have attempted to protect Native Hawaiian homesteading, such as the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920, which set aside 187,000 acres. Now, as of 1983, there was a federal and state task force that concluded that about 14,000 or 13,500 of these acres were improperly withdrawn through presidential executive orders and have been used by the military subsequently. The Kajihiro points out that Oahu and other areas in Hawaii are economically dependent on the military, and this does not always lead to the best decision making to represent various stakeholders. What Kajihiro calls for is for the military to disclose all pertinent environmental, economic, and social data in order to assess the true impacts. Steingraber in the 1987 piece, Resettlement and Villagization, Tools of Militarization in Southeast Ethiopia, looks at villagization and resettlement in historical context as a military strategy. It's been used in Vietnam, Guatemala, as well as Cambodia. In the 1984 and 85 famine in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government made plans to relocate virtually its entire rural population, somewhere between 33 and 37 million people by the 1990s. Like resettlement, villagization was justified in terms of ecological arguments in order to distribute people in line with accessible and available natural resources. They were in fact utilized to contain rural armed opposition and increase military control, and militarization in both senses of the term. First, imbuing the societies they create with military characteristics such as regimentation of labor, top-down decision-making, compulsory participation under the threat of corporal punishment, surveillance, and curfews. Second, These newly created communities are themselves used as military infrastructures and provide recruits for the army as well as for special militia forces responsible for locating and punishing suspected rebel collaborators. Most of the refugees describe villagization as the last in a series of repressive measures designed to weaken the resistance to government